Well, I think there's important areas of agreement and important differences. There's a general understanding, a common understanding of where the Iranian nuclear program stands. On the intelligence level, I think we basically have a similar picture. The differences start, of course, in terms of the urgency that the two sides attach to it. For Israel, this is the number one issue, absolutely critical. And for the U.S., much less so. It's one of the more important topics it faces. But the U.S. is really focused today domestically and externally on, I would say, three things. China, and Russia, especially with the Ukrainian crisis. The U.S. doesn't want to have to deal with this at this point.
And along those lines, and on the U.S. political side here, are we seeing the Iranian nuclear issue emerge as more of a partisan issue today, like so many other issues in the U.S.?
Well, I think, unfortunately, everything in the U.S. today has become politicized and polarized between the parties. But at least in terms of the importance of the issue, I don't think there are differences between Democrats and Republicans. There are maybe differences in how they want to address it. The Republicans take a somewhat harder line approach, but we had a couple of Republican presidents in the last 2 decades, Bush and Trump, who talked a very tough game, but in point of fact did no more than his predecessors, in some ways less. Trump imposed the maximum sanctions, but unlike Obama, for example, did not undertake a major cyber campaign against Iran.
Now, leaving the U.S. somewhat on the side here, we've seen a lot of ramped up threats and bluster by Iran and Israel here. Perhaps, and I guess a question for you, more than we've seen before, you've seen this ramp up, and from the perspective of Israel and Iran, do you think we're on the precipice of the end of diplomacy, of seeing the end of that road?
Well, first of all, I hope very much no, because there is no good military solution to the nuclear issue. Certainly that Israel can do. I mean, we can cause limited damage. We can set it back by a while. But I don't know of anyone who believes that Israel can destroy the Iranian nuclear program. As a matter of fact, even the U.S. can't do it anymore. It's too late for that. So I mean, the only thing that can lead to a long-term resolution, or at least long-term postponement of the Iranian nuclear program, is diplomacy. So let's hope we're going back towards that. We've seen the debate in Israel recently about our capabilities. People acknowledging for the first time, maybe, that they are, not the first time, but more so, that they are more limited than we would like to think. And then in the last few years, especially in the last 2 years of Mr. Netanyahu's tenure as premier, Israel was not doing what it has to do to assure that it has an effective option.
Now, these nuclear talks in Vienna, as they have been in the past, are wider than the U.S. and Iran. There's the P5+1 involved here, and we believe we have a leaning on where the Western European countries lie. But what about Russia and China? How big of a factor are they in this in determining the outcome of this diplomatic process?
Well, they're a very important part of the process, especially since we're now in a situation where the Iranians may have even succeeded in at least partly alienating them by the hardline positions that they took. And it may be possible for the first time in a good few years, since the JCPOA was negotiated in 2015, to achieve a common position among the different actors here: the U.S., the E3, in other words, France, Germany, and Britain, and Russia and China. If that is indeed the case, that certainly puts Iran in a very, very difficult position. And I think it increases the prospects of them coming back to the table, which is still, I would say, the smart money would indicate that they will come back to a deal. Otherwise, they will find themselves in a severe crisis with the entire international community. So Russia and China have an important role here.
And as we've seen, again, coming back to the ramped up level of threats going back and forth between Iran and Israel, what do you believe the main deterrent factor is for Israel at this point? Is it an inherent lack of ability on the military side, or is Hezbollah still the major deterrent factor perhaps involved here?
Well, both, and I would add to that a third, at least as critical factor is the American position. Obviously, the operational capacity to do it is critical because without it, there's nothing to talk about. Again, I believe Israel certainly has the ability to launch a limited attack, and that might buy more time for diplomacy. It might also lead the U.S. and the rest of the leaders of the international community to finally take definitive action, but certainly not the preferred route. We still have time. It's not as if Iran will have an operational nuclear capability tomorrow. Even if they ramp up to the 90% enrichment level, which is needed, and they could have enough, if they do so, they could have enough fissile material for a first bomb in weeks and additional bombs in a matter of months. They still need to weaponize a warhead, to complete development of a warhead. And the assumption is that for that, they need a year, probably closer to 2 years. So we still have time for diplomacy. And again, diplomacy is the only option that can lead to a long-term resolution of the problem.
And on the diplomatic track, still, the lid's been pretty tight on these negotiations in terms of leaks out of these negotiations in Vienna. But in terms of the type of deal that the sides may be seeking, what do we know? Would it resemble the 2015 deal, or is there something new in the works?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. Very little information has gotten out about the substance of the talks there. We can't simply go back to 2015 as it was because the Iranian program has advanced greatly since then. So various changes will have to be made regarding the uranium that they've already enriched to higher levels, about their use of advanced centrifuges, their overall R&D, nuclear R&D capabilities, and the military applications. These are all difficult issues to be resolved. The Iranians are playing very, very tough. At the moment, it looks like we're about to be in a real crisis situation. But I think it's also worth stepping back for a moment and taking into account that many negotiations reach precisely this kind of critical point, the turning point where it looks like everything is lost and the talks will collapse. And that's the point where the sides either do or do not make their concessions.
Now, another set of factors that have changed pretty dramatically since 2015. There's the Middle East itself, and alliances now shifting in the sand and elsewhere here. But new alliances between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis warming up. How does the shifting Persian Gulf essentially potentially affect the outcome of this whole process as well?
Well, first of all, you're right. Of course, there's been a dramatic shift in the regional balance of power, and that has considerable importance to this. The critical factor here at the moment is that I think all of the regional players, whether it's the UAE, the Saudis, Israel, others, the Iranians themselves, are all increasingly doubtful about the American commitment to act effectively here, to take a leading role in the region and to do what it takes to prevent Iran from going nuclear. And so what we've seen recently is the UAE and the Saudis holding talks with Iran and trying to see if they can maybe make nice and reduce the level of tensions. Might that come at the expense of the putative alliance with Israel, the anti-Iranian axis? Maybe. It's also possible that they will talk and develop various cooperative measures together with Israel at the same time. That would be a typical kind of behavior. But it also may mean that the prospects for the regional alliance have diminished. And again, we're all waiting for American leadership. That's the critical point. And Mr. Sullivan's visit will be very important in that regard because he and Mr. Blinken are the two architects of American policy.
Professor Chuck Freilich, as always, thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you.